And I will wish everyone a very good morning and welcome to Research Accelerator 2026. So lovely to see some of you here live. I know lots of the group are planning to catch up later with the recordings though. So hello if you are watching this on demand at a later stage. And so our opening session this morning is around thriving as a researcher in 2026. I want to kick us off with a bit of a question. We're mid-February now. I'm still not quite sure how that happened, but my calendar tells me that that is the case. And I suspect quite a few of you probably started this year with a list of goals, plans, intentions, resolutions. How many of you feel already like you're falling behind? Quick show of hands. Both hands in the case of some of you. Okay, so hopefully you can see each other's webcams there and you will realize that you are in very good company. So this is the kind of thing I'm hearing from researchers at the moment. They're telling me things like, every January, I tell myself this is the year I'm going to get on top of things. And before I know it, I'm back to my usual chaos and I feel like I failed before I've even started. Or they tell me that they have a beautiful plan. It's in their notebook or their Notion workspace. It's color coded. It looks really pretty, but they haven't done anything on it, which is a bit of a problem given we're already in the second month of the year. And I really want to say a couple of things about that. One is that I don't think that particular struggle is new. Failing to follow through on New Year's resolutions in particular has been an issue for quite a while now. But I think it's become even more problematic because we're going through a period of unprecedented change right now. So we've got AI reshaping how we work, funding landscapes are shifting, the expectation of what it means to be a researcher keeps evolving. And so that brings me to one of the core questions that I'm going to be talking about, and my fellow presenters are also going to be talking about over the next 4 days. How do you stay productive and focused when everything around you is constantly changing? And this isn't just a problem for researchers. I think it's a human problem right now. But I think it's hitting us particularly hard because of the systems that we're working and researching in. And the issue that I'm seeing happening right now is for lots of the researchers that I work with, as they fall further behind, they start to set bigger goals and harder tasks, and they try and be even more disciplined and they try and push harder. And for some people, that might work really well. But what I'm hearing from lots of you is that actually that's not helping at all. And in fact, it might be making things worse than it already is. So this morning, I want to talk about what we can do about that. Now, we're going to be talking about goal setting a little bit this morning. And I think it would be fair to say that goal setting is something that I have put way too much time into thinking about. And I will explain why. So goal setting, and in particular, setting SMART goals, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, was actually at the heart of my PhD research. So understandably, I have been clinging to that a little bit. I'm very reluctant to move on from setting goals that way. But having reflected on it over the summer, another aspect of my PhD research was the importance of reflecting on the strategies that you use in order to assess whether or not they are working well for you. And I think it's pretty clear that ideas like SMART goals are not working well for us right now. And so I think it would be a little bit foolish of me personally to not have a bit of a think about why that might be the case, and also have a think about how things might be done differently moving forward. Now, having said that, I'm very reluctant to completely drop the idea of goal setting, though. I do believe that if you don't know where you're going, it's going to be very hard to get there. But where I've landed on this is that I don't think the issue is with goal setting per se. I think it's the way that we're setting goals and the approach that we're taking to goal setting. And I think the reason that's not working right now is because of the complexity and unpredictability of life in general right now, but also research life in particular. So today, I'm going to explore a different approach in our opening conference session. And the ideas I'm presenting this morning are based in two absolutely brilliant books that I highly recommend you read. One called Tiny Experiments by Anne-Laure Lecomte and Intentional by Chris Bailey. Now, the names of the books and the names of the authors are at the end of my slides today. So to save yourself having to ask what I've just said or look anything up, end of the slides, I've got the information about both of the books that I'll be talking about today. And I will come back to those books again at the end of the session. But I think what both of these authors have done is something pretty impressive. They've taken this science of behavior change, basically, and made it usable for people like us who are currently drowning in competing priorities. So this morning, I'm going to be talking about why traditional goal setting often leaves us feeling like we failed, how to move from setting really rigid goals and resolutions to making flexible experiments. I'm going to talk a little bit about the concept of intentionality and why I think that matters more than motivation. And I'm also going to talk about some practical strategies that you can use over the next 4 days and also the coming weeks, just to put all of those ideas into practice. And my hope for the session this morning, I'm going to be presenting a lot of ideas. Take the ones that resonate with you, leave the rest. That's always my advice for these kinds of sessions. But one of the things that I do hope you'll leave the session with is a bit of a sense of permission. So permission to let go of productivity guilt, because we all have that. I know I certainly do. Permission to try things differently, because this is a different approach that I'm suggesting this morning. And permission to design a research life that doesn't require you to break yourself in the process of completing your work. So let's rethink goals and planning. And just before I get into the contents of this slide, I did want to say that there are some people who really thrive with having clear goals and structured plans. And if that is you and it's working, that's great. Keep on doing it. Feel free to exit the Zoom room now if you want. It sounds like you've got it nailed, and that's absolutely brilliant. Keep on doing what you're doing. But as I've just hinted at, I think for lots of the researchers that I'm working with, that traditional approach to goal setting isn't serving them well. So I want to explore what might not be working and what we can do differently. So when we set goals, particularly at the start of a new year, we tend to follow a familiar pattern. So we tend to look at what's wrong or maybe what's missing in lives. We identify something that needs to change, and then we create a plan to fix that. And the formula for that is usually something along the lines of you identify the problem. So for example, I'm not productive enough with my writing. You set a measurable, specific goal. In order to fix that, I will write for 2 hours every morning. You create a really detailed plan to help you get there. And then you try and use willpower and discipline to stick to it. So you time block, you use distraction blocking, you do all of the productivity, time management tools in your toolkit. And I think on paper, that's a very, very reasonable plan. But there's a fundamental flaw with that approach. So when you set goals that way, it treats goals as predictions about the future. Predictions that we feel obligated to fulfill, even when circumstances change. Now, Chris Bailey puts this brilliantly in his book. He talks about the fact that when we set a goal, we're predicting what we'll want in the future. We're predicting what resources we'll have available, and we're predicting what obstacles we'll encounter. But we're making that prediction with incomplete information. Now, I want you to think for a moment about a goal that you set maybe at our last quarterly planning session, or 6 months ago, or a year ago. So think about the last time you set goals. How much in your life has changed since then? Your workload, your energy levels, your priorities, maybe your life circumstances. And when our predictions inevitably turn out to be wrong, so if life throws us a curveball, or we just maybe don't have the capacity that we thought we'd have, we have a couple of choices. We can abandon the goal, which, to be honest, doesn't make us feel great, does it? I know personally I feel like a bit of a failure when I abandon goals. Or the other one that I'm also guilty of, I must say, we force ourselves to keep going regardless, and of course risk burning out. So neither of those options is particularly great. The other idea that Chris Bailey introduces in his book is the concept of the intention-action gap. And so that's the space between what we intend to do and what we actually do. I'm sure we've all experienced this. So you get up in the morning, you intend to start writing your journal article. Somehow 3 hours later, you've responded to 47 emails, you've reorganized your reference library and researched a completely tangential topic that might be useful later. I can tell by the looks on faces right now that many of you can relate to that scenario. So the intention was there, the action, not so much. So one of the issues with traditional goal setting is it doesn't give us the tools we need to bridge that gap. Traditional goal setting tells us we need to be more disciplined, or we need to manage our time better. And I don't think time management is the problem. We don't fail to follow through on our intentions because we're lazy and undisciplined. We don't follow through because of the reasons I've got on this slide. So because we're trying to force a rigid plan onto an unpredictable life, because we don't have the cognitive, emotional, or practical resources in that moment. And Anne-Laure Lecomte has a lovely way of framing that. She talks about a triple check, which is checking in with your head, heart, and hand in terms of your cognitive, emotional, and practical resources. It could be that the goal you've the goal you've set yourself isn't aligned with what you truly value. Or it could be that the task feels aversive in some way. So it might be boring, unpleasant, frustrating, or meaningless. One of the main points I want you to take away from today's session is if you are not getting through work that you intended to be doing, rather than treating that as a failure, that's actually data. That's really valuable information that is telling you there's something misaligned, and that's worth paying attention to. I'm going to talk more about that and the other points on this slide throughout the rest of the presentation. So essentially, we're now getting into, if traditional goal setting doesn't work, what can we do instead? And this is where we get into a very lovely idea of designing tiny experiments. So this idea of tiny experiments offers us a completely different approach. And I think it is incredibly well suited to researchers because it aligns with how we already think about our work. When we design our research studies, I imagine most of you don't assume that you know exactly how it's going to turn out. If you knew the answer to your research question, why bother doing research in the first place? So instead, what we do is we collect data. But when it comes to our own lives, we abandon that research mindset entirely. So we make these rigid goals, and then we are surprised when they don't work out the way that we planned. So this idea of tiny experiments, there's a couple of reasons that I think it's a great approach for us as researchers. First of all, it asks us to bring our research brain to our goals. It's basically something we already know how to do as researchers. But the second reason I think it's ideal is that our work as researchers is inherently uncertain. We can't predict when reviewer feedback will arrive, when a collaborator will respond, whether our methodology will work out the way that we planned. And I think tiny experiments gives us a way to navigate that uncertainty without falling into paralysis or overwhelm. So what is a tiny experiment? So Lecompf defines it as a low-stakes, time-bound test of a behavior, habit, or approach that you're curious about. So I'm going to break that down for you. So low stakes, this isn't something you're committing to forever. You are just actually trying it out. It's an experiment. If it doesn't work, that's not a failure, that's data. Time-bound, so you decide up front how long you'll test it. Maybe it's a week, maybe it's a month, but it's not something you're signing up for eternity. It's a test, so you're gathering information about what works for you in your life with your constraints and preferences. And I think that's super, super important. These experiments are for you personally. It's not generic advice in a productivity book. This is what works for you. It's a behavior, habit, or approach. So it's something that's specific and actionable, not vague and aspirational. And most importantly, it's something you're curious about. So it's something it's driven by genuine interest. So it's not driven by obligation or other people's expectations. It's something that you want to find out. So I've got a few examples to show you how you can take more sort of traditional goals and reframe them as tiny experiments. So something that's a more traditional goal might be, I will write for 2 hours every morning before I check my email. I bet lots of you have tried that one, actually. So instead, a tiny experiment might be, for the next 2 weeks, so it's time-bound, I'm going to test whether writing in 25-minute blocks after my morning coffee helps me make more progress on my paper. I'll track how much I write and I'll track how I feel afterwards. Do you hear the difference there? So the experimental version has got a defined endpoint. It uses curiosity as the driver. It includes reflection, and it doesn't assume that what you're trying is the only right or correct way. Another example, traditional goal might be, I will say no when I'm asked to take on committee work or other service obligations. I bet that's also something many of you can relate to. So a tiny experiment might be, this month, I'm going to experiment with waiting 24 hours before I respond to any requests that would add to my workload. I want to see if that pause helps me make better decisions about what to take on. Right, so let's talk now about why tiny experiments are a great idea, why they work so well. So, firstly, they lower the psychological stakes. So when you're running an experiment, there's no such thing as failure. If something doesn't work, you've learned something valuable. And that often reduces fear and resistance that can keep us stuck. Secondly, builds in flexibility. Life is unpredictable, particularly right now. So experiments acknowledge that. You can adjust, pivot, or just stop an experiment based on what you're learning. So you're not locked into a rigid plan. And third, they generate actual self-knowledge. So most productivity advice tells you what worked for someone else. Tiny experiments tell you what works for you. And I think, as I hinted at before, that's infinitely more valuable. Now, in terms of the process you might follow if you're trying this approach out, this is the process that the author suggests. So you start out by observing something. So observing something that's not working for you or observing something that you're curious about. You create a hypothesis, and I know most of us are qualitative researchers, but I'm sure in your research methods papers you've come across the idea of hypotheses before. So a hypothesis is something that you test. So that's exactly what you're going to do. Once you've got your hypothesis, you're going to test it for a defined period. And then we analyze, what did we learn from the experiment? And if it didn't quite go to plan, is there something that you might tweak in the next iteration? Or are you going to head off and try something else entirely? So that process, I think most of us already know how to do. It's basically the research process, albeit a quantitative one. But I think it's something that is very easy to apply in our day-to-day lives, and particularly if you start somewhere small with this. And I'm going to come back to that idea in my takeaway slide a little bit later. Now, I think where the idea of tiny experiments can get really powerful is when we combine them with the concept of intentionality. And this is where goals come back into the picture a little bit, but in a slightly different way than you might be used to. So we're not treating goals as rigid predictions that we force ourselves to meet. I'm about to talk about them as being a layer within a values-aligned system that works with our experiments, not against them. So, power of intentionality. Whoops, slides are getting carried away there. So Chris Bailey's book introduces a deceptively simple idea. Intentionality is deciding what to do before you do it. Now, how obvious does that sound? If there was ever an obvious statement, that would have to be right up there. But is it actually obvious? So have a think for a moment about how much of your day unfolds on autopilot. You respond to emails as soon as they come in. You attend meetings because they're on your calendar. You work on whatever feels urgent right now. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I think we all operate on autopilot to some degree. But when we increase our level of intentionality, we become significantly more likely to follow through on what matters to us. So Bailey makes a distinction between two types of intentions: default intentions and deliberate intentions. So default intentions are the things we do automatically. So they're the things we do because they're habit or we're conditioned. Now, I did some research into this actually when I was doing my meditation teacher training, and the figures that fly around in terms of what is conscious versus subconscious and unconscious behavior vary wildly. So I'm not going to get caught up in the what's the actual figure and what's the actual percentage here. I've used the figures that he uses in his book, which is that default intentions make up about 40 to 45% of our day-to-day behavior. Now, deliberate intentions are the things we consciously choose to do, making up the other 55 to 60%. Now, both types of intentions have a place. The key is knowing which one you're operating from. So when we're relying entirely on default intentions, you're pretty much outsourcing control of your day to past conditioning. You're doing things the way you've always done them, whether or not they're still serving you. But if you bring deliberate intention to your choices, even the small choices that you make during your day, then that creates a little bit of space to change. Now, Chris Bailey introduces this concept. He calls it the intention stack, which is a way of understanding how our intentions exist at different levels. And these are all nested within each other. So we've got the present moment, which is what you're doing right now. And that sits within your plans, the habits and routines you're building. That sits within your goals, the results you're working towards. And hopefully your goals sit within your priorities, the areas of life that matter to you. Now, one of the take-home messages from this morning's session, and this is something we're going to be exploring again on Sunday, is this idea of values. So at the very heart of this intention stack are your values. All these other aspects are nested within that. And your values are the core motivations that drive everything you do. Now, the reason this is important is that if your actions are in line with your values, you are much more likely to complete them. So I thought I would give you an example from my own life using this intention stack. And this is something that I mentioned in a newsletter late last year. So I was very fortunate. Just before Christmas, I had a project I was working on in Wellington, and I had the chance to catch up with Christine and Lacey for breakfast one morning. It was lovely. And we were chatting over breakfast, and Christine asked me a very sensible question, which was, how on earth did I manage to complete my meditation teacher training on top of running a business? And I responded at the time, but the question actually gave me quite a bit of pause for thought. So thanks for the question, Christine. I very much appreciated it. And while, as I mentioned in the newsletter email that I've just mentioned that I sent last year, some of that was to do with saying no to other things, a huge part of it came down to that being aligned with my values. So to give you an example from my own life of this stack, one of my core values is growth and learning. My priority within that was developing my meditation practice. My goal was to complete my meditation teacher training. My plan was to spend 30 to 60 minutes a day doing coursework. And my present moment intention when I woke up in the morning was to meet my classmates online on Zoom at 5:30 every weekday, which I'm sure sounds like a real chore, but it actually wasn't. And the reason for that was that it aligned with my values. Everything was lined in a way that meant that I was moving towards something that was important to me, that was part of my core values. So I think this idea of an intention stack can be really, really powerful. So when your immediate actions are aligned with your deeper values, a couple of things happen. The action feels meaningful, so you're not just ticking boxes, and you're much more likely to follow through. Requires less willpower. Now, as I've just mentioned, we're going to come back to values on Sunday morning, so I don't want to get too sidetracked or go down the values rabbit hole this morning, but I did just want to mention a few, given that I'm talking about Chris Bailey's book. So, as I've just hinted at, your values are the foundation. And Bailey draws quite heavily on the research of Schwartz, who identified 12 universal human values. I've just got 6 of them on the slide, just to give you an idea of the kinds of things we're talking about. So we've got self-direction, achievement, benevolence, universalism, security, and stimulation. And we all have these values in different proportions. Some will be really strong for you, others won't matter much at all. Now, why am I talking about this in relation to goal setting? Well, I hope I've made that point already, but just in case I haven't, when your goals or your tiny experiments are aligned with your values, you don't need much discipline. They feel much more natural, almost effortless. If your goals are misaligned with values, no amount of willpower is going to help. Just to give you an example of that, let's say your goal is to network more this year because people keep telling you that networking is important for your career. If you're someone who deeply values solitude and autonomy, or if social events drain you, you're going to really struggle with that goal. And it's not because you're lazy or antisocial, it's because it conflicts with who you are. A better approach might be to reframe the goal. So you might instead decide to build deeper relationships with 3 colleagues whose work I admire. So it's the same underlying objective, but it's framed in a way that honors your values. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about in terms of Chris's book, before I talk about some practical strategies to take away and take any comments, reflections, or questions that you might have, is this idea of aversion and desire. So he suggests a formula in the book, which is the strength of your intention is desire minus aversion. So it's how much you want to do it minus how much you want to avoid it. When desire outweighs aversion, following through on things is really easy. And most tasks or goals have some sort of combination of both of those. In terms of if you find yourself avoiding getting things done, if you're not following through on intentions, it does pay to actually have a look at a task and think about what might make it aversive. And Chris Bailey has got 6 characteristics in his book: boring, unpleasant, frustrating, too far in the future, unstructured, or meaningless. So if there is something that you're finding you're not following through on, take a pause, have a moment, and have a think about whether or not it hits any of these points. It's reasonably certain that it's going to touch on at least one of these. Now, the good news is for each of these, there are strategies to counteract it. So a few quick examples. If a task is boring, make it fun. We learnt that with all the Ali Abdaal stuff we've done over the last little while. You might make it more challenging. You might add some gamification in. You might set a timer for yourself to see how fast you can do it. If it's unpleasant, once again, what does this look like if it were fun? Pair it with something enjoyable. So if it's something like a data entry task, might be that you listen to your favorite podcast or your favorite music playlist while you're doing it. Is it frustrating? Well, if that's the case, why is it frustrating? And can you get help with that? So one of the most common things I see as being, common thing that I see researchers find frustrating is research software. Now, can you ask for help? Is there a colleague that might be able to assist? Can you ask me? Can you ask another Research Accelerator member? So what is it that's making it frustrating, and can you find a solution to that? If it's too far off in the future, break it into smaller milestones that are closer in time. If it's unstructured, add more structure. So define when, where, and how you'll do it. And if it's meaningless, connect it to your values. Find the deeper why. Now, it's pretty unlikely that we're going to be able to eliminate aversion entirely. There are some tasks that are just unpleasant. I suspect I've got a fair idea what that is for some of you. But we can reduce the aversion enough to give it a chance that desire can win out. Okay. Right. I have just covered a lot of information over the last half hour. And so what I want to do is a bit of a recap, touch on some of those ideas in terms of practical strategies that you might like to try out. Because as always, I'm not suggesting that you put all of those things into practice. As I said at the start of the session, take what resonates with you and leave the rest. But if you're looking for some sort of tangible, easy things to try out after the session this morning, here's a few ideas. So you might start with one tiny experiment. Now, I'm suggesting one here, folks, not 5, not 10, just one. And I can see by the smiles on your faces that you were planning to go out and try a whole bunch of them. Lovely enthusiasm, really appreciate that. But actually, can we just start with one? So start small. Pick something you're really genuinely curious about, and something small enough that it feels almost too easy to do. So maybe it's something like I'm going to experiment with doing my most important task before I open my email for the next week. The one that I'm going to try is I'm going to test out whether taking a 10-minute walk after lunch helps my afternoon focus. So they're simple, tiny, easy things, and there's one of them. Okay? I think I've emphasized that enough now. Do make sure if you're trying this out that you've got a really clearly defined experiment. So what are you testing for how long? How will you know if it's working? Run the experiment, and then the most important part, reflect at the end on what you've learned. So don't just move on to the next experiment. Pause and ask yourself what worked, what didn't, what surprised me, what do I want to try next? Now, something that might help with your tiny experiments is implementation intentions. So making sure that you build in when you're going to work on it. So it's not sometime this week. You're really, really specific about when. Where will you do it? Is it your office, outside, a cafe, the library? And how will you start? What's the very first action? So in his book, Chris Bailey talks about that kind of specificity. James Clear in Atomic Habits also talks about this. It massively increases follow through. So it's not just about setting an intention, you're sort of pre-deciding the conditions that are going to trigger action. So instead of saying, I'm going to work on my journal article this week, you might say on Tuesday and Thursday at 9 o'clock, right after Research Accelerator, shut up and organize, I'm going to sit at my desk and open my document, and I'll write for 25 minutes without having my email open. So it's very, very specific and clear. So the idea there is you're creating this implementation intention. You're tying that intention to inevitable events in your day so that when those events happen, action will follow. Now, I'd also really encourage everyone, and we will talk about this, as I've said a couple times now, more on Sunday morning, but just taking 10 minutes sometime over the next few days just to reflect on your values. I don't suggest searching online for what are my values, because you're going to get a whole pile of quizzes that in order to get the results, they're going to charge you money for. And there is one of those on Chris Bailey's website, actually. Don't bother about doing anything like that. It's just actually taking this a little bit more informally and thinking about what matters most to me right now. So not what should matter, not what matters to your thesis supervisor or your organization, but what matters to you personally. Maybe it's intellectual freedom. It might be helping students. I suspect that's the case for many of you. Maybe it's stability and security, or maybe it's making an impact. There's no right or wrong answer here. But once you actually identify one or two core values, maybe just stop and ask yourself about whether your current goals or the experiments that you're setting yourself, whether they align with those values. Strategy 4, plan for aversion. So have a think about a goal or a task you've been avoiding and ask yourself which of those aversion triggers that might be hitting. Is it boring, unstructured, too far away? And once you identify the trigger, can you deploy a strategy for that? So that's a nice, easy one to do, particularly if you have been not necessarily procrastinating, because I don't know anyone that has time to procrastinate these days, to be perfectly honest. But I know there's certainly tasks that I find I sometimes should be getting on with and I find something else to do instead. So it's those sorts of things that I'm referring to there. But I think if I had to recommend a single strategy for you to take into 2026, it would actually be this one. We're often very good at taking action, and we're not so good at reflecting what we've learned from that action. So I'd really suggest building reflection not just into your experiments if you decide to do them, but into your days and weeks more broadly. So maybe it's a 10-minute journal session that you do once a day or once a week, where you ask yourself things like what worked, what didn't work, what do I need to adjust, what am I learning about myself and how I work best. And I think that type of reflection turns actions and turns random trial and error into something that can actually be incredibly, incredibly helpful. And while there are aspects, as I said at the start of my session today, of my PhD research that I perhaps am leaving behind in the current environment, self-reflection was one of the key things that I found made a difference for people. So I think self-reflection is something we could all have a little bit more of in our lives. Okay, I'm heading towards time, folks. So I've just got a summary slide of what the key takeaways from the session are. And then I've also, as promised, got the details of those two books. So I've got the names of the books and the authors for both. If you're wondering why I've put Tiny Experiments bigger than the other book, that wasn't an artistic decision. Well, it did help that the images I found matched what I planned for the slide. I know you're all super, super busy and are probably unlikely to go away and read two books after a 4-day event that we've got this week. So what I'm going to say is if you only read one of these, choose Tiny Experiments. It's an outstanding book. It's incredibly well written. It's a very easy read. And it would be well worth a look. She goes into a lot more detail than I was able to this morning around why traditional goal setting doesn't work so well these days. And there's lots of fabulous advice, including a whole chapter, by the way, on how helpful it can be to work with others. So it was a wonderful shout out to our Research Accelerator community and the virtual co-working that we do, and the virtual co-working that we'll be doing across the 4 days of the event as well. So I've got a couple of questions on the slide for you to have a think about. Got distracted there by the chat, which I've just noticed there are a few things popping up there. So fire away if you've got any questions, comments. I'd love to know if you're planning to try any of that. Let me know in the chat. Are you going to have a go at a tiny experiment? Are you going to have a look at a task and see what your aversion triggers are? What might you be trying afterwards? Now, Pat, is that a question for me? Or is that a reflection question for yourself? Can you let me know in the chat? That would be helpful. And I'd love to hear what you're taking away from our first conference session before we take a bit of a pause to swap speakers. Great. Okay, thanks, Pat. Oh, great comment there from, so lots of you are going to reassess your values. Make sure that you either come back Sunday morning or watch the recording on demand later of the session that we're going to do about values. I love some of the stuff that's coming through. Lacey's comment there was, I feel like this is on point for a lot of what I've realized this year, the need to collect a lot more data about what's working, and she's experimenting with what spaces are the most productive for her. That's awesome. Ruth Jackson's going to join Shut Up and Research 3 times next week. Love it. And Jane's commented about my optimism that we're too busy to procrastinate these days. I did realize as I said it, I was being slightly optimistic, but I am an optimist. I can't help myself. And just circling back to Pat's question, I'm pretty sure the triple check I mentioned, and I was aware as I said it that that was quite brief, was head, heart, and hand, which was around your cognitive, emotional, and practical resources. So the cognitive stuff is, are you too exhausted? Are you distracted? And that's why you're not able to complete the task. The heart is around more emotional things associated with it. And the hand is your practical resources. Have you got the time? Have you got the resources? Have you got the skills to do the task. And she frames that so, so beautifully in her book. We actually talked about that at Productivity Chat on Tuesday. Lovely, lovely stuff. Too many for me to put hearts on, in fact. Okay, I am going to stop the recording and also stop the screen share.